there is a tree called the Manchineel. Hippomane Mancinella. That Hippomane part that basically means horse madness. This tree has sap that will fry your skin on a rainy day, and it has a fruit that is lovingly called the death apple. And if you want to look for it, you can find it in the Caribbean, Florida, Bahamas, Mexico, Central America, and I believe you can find it in the northern South America region. The Guinness Book of World Records back in 2011 called this the deadliest tree in the world. Is it though? Or is it just folklore and anecdotes, whatever? Is there some truth that we can extract from this history, or I don't know, let's find out. So the Manchineel tree, it made its first appearance in European literature in 1494. Christopher Columbus was on his second trip sailing from the Canary Islands to the New World. And he had in tow with him a young doctor, Diego Alvaro Chanca. And Chanca was to tend to health needs, of course. I guess that's what a doctor does, right? And also to report back to Spain everything that he saw. So in January of 1494, on the island of Marie Galante in Guadeloupe, Chanca sat in a hut, by the way, built out of the remains of the Santa Maria, which wrecked a couple of years earlier. So, I don't know, is that the first European recycling in the New World? Anyway, Chanca wrote about a tree of this island that they landed at to resupply with water and wood. It was a sweet-smelling wild fruit similar to a crabapple. And I quote, "of which some crew unwisely tasted, and with just a touch of their tongues their faces swelled, and to them came so great a burning and pain that they appeared to be mad." Yeah, maybe dumb for eating that fruit, but anyway, he goes on to say that the symptoms were remedied by dousing or drinking of cold items, but I gotta say, who in their right mind goes to a new world, grabs the first fruit they see, will bite into? No! Just no. Anyway, I mean, I promise you, it's only a vaguely passing resemblance to an apple. Anyway, in February 1494, 12 ships returned to Sevilla, one with this letter from Chanca written to the city council, and it's published as a first real taste of the New World. Flora, fauna, people, it mentions the Manchineel tree, and that is, of course, where the mystique with this tree begins and continues to evolve with subsequent trips and misadventures. In 1520, Peter Martir d'Anguera relates an incident of May 1494, just a few months later, when 30 Spaniards hid along the salt river of Santa Cruz Island. They were waiting to ambush a canoe coming their way with 8 men and 8 women, and they moved to attack. And these indigenous men and women let fly a volley of arrows with apparently great rapidity and accuracy. So before the Spaniards had time to protect themselves with their shields, a Galician man was killed by a woman, and that same woman killed or injured another one. So, I mean, kudos on the good aim. It was, anyway, discovered that their poisoned arrows contained a kind of liquid that oozed out when the point broke. And throughout his writings, D'Anguera describes numerous scenes of death by poison arrow attributed to our death apple. And the legend of the Manchineel poison arrow becomes even more established. Also of interest, of the 1,200 men on board Columbus's 17 ships in that second trip to the New World, it's believed that there was a 33 or so year old soldier named Juan. And this kid surely had heard of the poisonous fruit experience some fellow sailors had. Hopefully he wasn't one of them that had partaken, but he probably had no clue that it was going to become part of his own legend. See, Juan was a blue blood, nephew to the first Duke of whatever, Marquis of Cadiz, and third Count of Arcos, and etc., etc. But here in the New World, it was just a foot soldier who had to work like the rest. And work he did. After the local indigenous tribes rebelled against the Spanish conquistadors, he was made a captain of one contingent from the new settlement of Santo Domingo to quell unrest and rebellion from the Taíno Indians. And this is where we first hear his full name, Juan Ponce de Leon. By 1513, he had founded a couple of towns. He had been governor of the Dominican Republic. He had been kicked out of the governorship by Columbus's own son. He had 5 kids of his own that he raised as a single father because his wife had died. And he discovered this little place called Florida. He visited for 3 brief weeks, laid claim on behalf of Spain, of course. And, as a side note, I should say that one thing historians have determined he did not do, ever, was search for some fountain of youth. Didn't happen. Anyway, after seeing Cortez's success, and worried he'll lose his claim, he gathers supplies, tools, horses, livestock, 200 armed settlers, onto a couple of ships and sails in February of 1521 to settle La Pascua de Florida, Festival of Flowers. It's a Easter Sunday thing if you don't know. Presumably because he first laid eyes on the eastern coastline on a Easter Sunday 8 years earlier. He sails through a storm. He arrives on the western Florida coast, but he hasn't really figured on the new inhabitants being any more difficult to subjugate than the Taíno and other Caribbean groups. So Ponce and his men, they come ashore, and possibly, we believe, maybe around Safety Harbor. It's Old Tampa Bay, for those who know. And they set up shop for 4-ish months, and then the arrows start flying. The Calusa indigenous, were already quite familiar with and strongly disliked Europeans. How it goes down, we can't really be exactly sure, but by most accounts, it happens fast. Men start dying. The would-be conquistador of Florida backs off to rally his men for another charge to protect their ground. But, therein lies the danger of leading, right? The local Calusa people of coastal Florida made arrowheads with sharp seashell and shark's tooth that could apparently pierce a reckless conquistador's armor. And one of these arrows goes into Ponce's thigh, just missing his femoral artery. Down he goes. Even as others are falling dead around him, all sense of bravery is gone, their leader has dropped, and along with 80 or so other buddies, Ponce is weak, he can't even stand. Someone breaks the arrow shaft off, and survivors drag Ponce back to the boat, and they row for their ship anchored offshore. And after a short debate, they say, screw it, let's get the hell out of here. We'll try again later. And they sail to Havana to recuperate. Well, in all that confusion, that arrowhead is still lodged in his thigh bone. Doctors eventually get around to it. They fail to remove it successfully. His fever grows, he's in and out of consciousness, and makes final preparations, which is probably wise because he's dead, in June of 1521. Just a week or two later? I don't know. Anyway, today Numerous books claim that Ponce died of a poison arrow dipped in the sap of the Manchineel tree. It's hard to be sure what this, where this explanation first appeared, but it seems that those earliest descriptions of his death do not claim this. Now, there were contemporary reports of death by poison arrows and retellings of the earliest interactions with local tribes, across the region, and it was known that many of the indigenous people of the Caribbean used poison arrows, but this had only been second encounter with the Calusa. And other sources of poison, they existed. There's curare, which contains strychnine, the sandbox tree, which is Hira crepitans. It's a relative of the Manchineel, sure. There's all kinds of euphorbias that are similar. Add to this that there are animal-based poisons, and it becomes such a blurry understanding of what could have happened. And it's equally true that the Spanish colonists of the 16th century had no real concept of this thing called sepsis. A perfectly plausible description of his symptoms. He may have simply died of an untreated wound with a broken, unclean arrowhead embedded in his bone that simply could not heal in the steamy summer tropics. But I'm not alone in this, because doubt was cast on Manchineel poisoning all the way back in 1578 when the governor of Venezuela, Juan de Pimentel, he prepared a report of the region, and in it he tells that an old Indian woman explained the Manchineel poison used on their arrows was not necessarily very strong. What made it stronger was being mixed with crushed spiders, venomous frogs, and blood of women. I'm going to presume he meant menstrual blood? I don't know. In 1857, a botanist by the charming name of Dr. Berthold Karl Seemann added even more doubt, pointing out that, like a lot of euphorbias, the toxins in the sap quickly lose strength, becoming useless because it's volatile and it's short-lived. Okay. I mean, there were numerous people writing about whether it was poisonous for 100 years or poisonous for minutes. I mean, think about it. What good is a poison arrow that takes hours or days to work? Even if it took minutes, for hunting purposes, your prey may have run off already. And for battle purposes, I mean, your assailants already hacked you to pieces long before they're writhing in pain. That seems problematic. If anything, I can easily imagine septic shock coming from being stuck to the bone with a seashell arrowhead covered in sappy goo, spider bits, frog parts, and menstrual blood. Regardless of any extra whatever, just knowing that was shot into me might do me in. And don't forget, it's a 400-year wait to the nearest dose of penicillin. Today, we certainly can't ask anyone to clarify. They're all dead, especially the Calusa indigenous people who shot Ponce, for example. I mean, there's little substantial documented history of their lives outside of European interactions. By the late 1700s, they had been broken down by invasions from all angles: Spaniards, English, other tribes, of course, diseases, so on. Today, that tribe is long gone, so mystery unsolved. But the Carib people, after which the region, takes its name, Caribbean, were said to have used Manchineel poison arrows in many of their excursions to overtake the Arawak and dominate the region. It even had a medicinal use and was used for trial by ordeal. It was occasionally used to poison water sources. A young Captain Horatio Nelson discovered this in 1780 when he was poisoned by Indians who had dropped leaves into the spring he drank from while on an excursion into Nicaragua. A similar practice was observed at least into the mid-1800s, poisoning wells and water tanks, and it appears some of the main irritant the chemicals are water-soluble in that plant. Makes sense now, right? It might also be why dousing with water in the first 5 minutes after exposure helps reduce the effects, like we heard from Chanka back in 1494. Some books say that the indigenous groups would tie people to the tree's trunk and let them suffer when the morning dew or a rain brought the tree's essence down to burn their skin. There's no first-hand accounts to attest that this ever happened, but I mean, hey, it makes a great image, doesn't it? I mean, even more recently in a 1958 film, Wind Across the Everglades, there was a notorious poacher named Cottonmouth, played by Burl Ives, and he ties a victim to the tree, or I guess he orders him to be tied to the trunk of a Manchineel tree, and oh, the screams, no, not the Manchineel! Yeah. Anyway, it was 1958. This deadly encounter between Ponce and Manchineel that we're questioning was by no means the last. Encounters just go on and on. In the mid-1600s, Alexander Excumelin, he writes a famous book about pirates. He talks about cutting off a branch to fan away bugs from his face. And the next day, his face has swelled and blistered. And he also claims anyone that ate the fruit would have a thirst all the Thames River couldn't quench. And they would soon die raving mad. Hyperbole much? All the way forward, 1910, at the turn of the century, construction of a railroad extension to Key West, Florida. Manchineel strikes again. And at this time, there was a hurricane suddenly overtaking a section of that railroad's building site. So there's a construction superintendent who secures himself to a nearby tree with his belt so he doesn't get washed out to sea. Not until it's a little too late did he realize, oh, damn, that's a Manchineel tree. But by now, sap from the wind-splintered branches is oozing into his open wounds and helping him not at all. He lived. And let's bring it forward to 1953. Sailors landing in the Antilles have fallen victim from eating the fruit again! Again! Stop with eating the damn fruit! It is not an apple! Doesn't even look really like an apple. So they had to put up signs with a branch to warn people against the tree for young cadets. My favorite is a man who broke off a small 2mm twig. I don't know who was measuring this, but okay, 2mm twig of the tree between his thumb and forefinger for reasons lost to history. And a half an hour later, he's walking up to a cocoa tree to micturate, which is one of my favorite words discovered while researching this, fancy way of saying to pee. And about 30, 40 minutes after that, he feels a burning sensation down there. But other animals have not been so lucky through history as humans, or at least guys trying to pee. There's a sick example of humans being human. Trigger warning, animal cruelty here. There's a journal from 1877 that relates yet another example of scientists doing cruelty for the sake of learning. After sniffing a vial that had been shipped to England and getting soreness in their noses, they tasted a dab and their throats burned because science. Recovering from that, they test a dog. They inject sap into the cellular tissue of a dog, and the dog dies a day later. And after that, several guinea pigs were next, and they inject into the veins. And seriously. Anyway. So, what does the modern world say? Fatalities aren't really known in modern literature, though it's certainly possible. I mean, enough of anything is poisonous and it'll kill you. People probably have died from eating the fruit of the Manchineel. It's just not really documented. If you do want a description of what it's like to eat this fruit, there was a paper written by radiologist Nicola Strickland, who unwisely chomped down on a Manchineel fruit back in 2000. In 2000, have they not learned? On the Caribbean island of Tobago. And a quote from her paper says, "I rashly took a bite from this fruit and found it pleasantly sweet. My friend partook at my suggestion," great friend. "Moments later, we noticed a strange, peppery feeling in our mouths, which gradually progressed into a burning, tearing sensation. Tightness of the throat. The symptoms worsened over a couple of hours until we could barely swallow solid food because the excruciating pain and the feeling of a huge obstructing pharyngeal lump. Sadly, the pain was exasperated by most alcoholic beverages, although mildly appeased by pina coladas." So what's going on here? I mean, the tree holds a cocktail of toxins, including Hippomane A and B, as well as some yet to be identified items. Don't eat it, you dumbassium. Hippo, welcome to the afterlife, Omanin C? I don't know. The tree today is a bit more rare because, well, I mean, they cleared it for settlements, for safety, I suppose, and, coconut groves because, a tree stood up for itself and said, "Don't eat my damn fruit, it ain't for you," and we said, "Yeah, it's nice, we're gonna cut you down." But in conclusion, I'd say we can't really say Manchineel was the cause of Ponce de Leon's death. I mean, at best, it was a co-conspirator, right? With maybe some other ingredients, or maybe it was just septic shock. But I will say I have no desire to risk taking any naps under this tree. I'm not gonna hide there on a rainy day. I think it's generally stupid to pick up any apple-y looking thing in an alien world, let alone eat the damn thing. And when discovering worlds, maybe it's best to just wear a full body acid-proof bubble bodysuit and wear mittens when you pee. And by the way, botanists of the 18th and 19th century were true jerks, prone to sheer stupidity. Anyway, this is Twigsy. I'm Charles. Thank you for joining me. And remember, plants have a lot to say. They've been, screaming at us. Maybe we should listen. Not eat all the fruit we see. Okay. Where's that? This is so weird. Oh, that's a terrible spot for a boil.